Lynchings of black men were all too common throughout the South after the Civil War. Oddly, it was a mountain county in western Virginia that only had 3 recorded lynchings in its history that spurred the passage of the first anti-lynching law in the former Confederacy. Today we tell that story. Hello folks, I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. Now, before we get started, I'd like to ask a favor of you. Go down below, click that subscribe button, and then ding the bell so you get notification of every new episode that comes out. And we'd also appreciate it if you'd give us a thumbs up if you don't mind. Be sure to also share us with all your friends, whether they be on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Reddit, or wherever you hang out online.
You know, Steve, I would think that if this was in this day and age, the media would make a whole lot about this, considering that it was in Western Virginia at that time, and we're talking about Southwest Virginia.
Right.
But they'd be making a whole lot of, news talking about this sort of thing. It wasn't the case back in those days. This was completely almost, unheard of to a certain degree.
Well, in this county, it was unheard of for people to die in these lynchings.
Right.
The unfortunate thing is that each one that came along was worse than the last one, and the last one was really bad. We've talked about that one on a former podcast, so you know what I'm talking about. And that just spurred the passage of legislation to try to, rein that in a little bit, and that's what we're going to tell you about today. Wise County, Virginia, had been relatively free of the racial strife that had permeated the South after the Civil War. Black miners and white miners both worked the coal mines in the county, although they were kept separate with very little conflict. All that changed in 1902 with the first of 3 highly charged incidents. On June 5th of that year, a 28-year-old black man named Wiley Gwynne, a miner and owner of a boarding house in Toms Creek near Coburn, was arrested. Now, Gwynne was charged with assaulting the 12-year-old daughter of a farmer named Franklin Green. It was alleged Gwynne had grabbed the girl, who immediately screamed, attracting the attention of a group of white men who quickly freed her and captured Mr. Gwynne. Wiley Gwynne was taken before a magistrate in Bondtown and given a hearing and then was formally charged. As he was about to be placed in the jail in Bondtown prior to being transported to Wise, a mob of about 500 men, including Mr. Green, invaded the jail and took Gwynne. Wiley Gwynne managed to break free of his captors and began to run away, but was shot and killed as he tried to make his escape.
Wow. Well, the next successful lynching occurred 18 years later. On Friday, November the 12th, 1920, a black man named Dave Hurst, also referred to in newspaper accounts as Dave Hunt, allegedly attacked a 60-year-old white woman at her home outside of Appalachia, Virginia. Hurst supposedly broke into the woman's home in Cane Patch and assaulted her. After the incident, the woman flagged down a passing passenger train and then told them what had happened and that the man who attacked her was walking along the railroad tracks just ahead of the train. The conductor started the train and began looking around and looking for the attacker, but when Hurst realized the train was just behind him, was following him, he ran off into the woods to make his escape. Unfortunately for him, crew members of that train immediately jumped off and ran in hot pursuit, quickly capturing Hurst.
He was turned over to the authorities and transported to the county jail in Wise. 2 days later, a mob of about 75 men managed to overpower the jail guard, broke down the door to his cell, and took him off for some rough justice. They put him in an automobile and headed down past Norton, then on to Appalachia. Not far after they passed through Blackwood, the mob stopped at a bridge near Kent Junction and lynched Dave Hurst by hanging him from that bridge. The mob broke up after that, and nobody was arrested, at least not immediately. Eventually, though, one of the members of that mob was arrested, Shaler B. Tate. Now, Tate was tried and convicted of manslaughter a year later. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. A second man, A.L. Napier, was also arrested and tried, convicted to 2 years in the state penitentiary. Both men were eventually pardoned by Governor E. Lee Trinkle. Now, these arrests, which are unusual in cases like this, can be attributed to one man, can't they, Rod?
Yes, they can. They can mostly be attributed to the sheriff of Wise County at the time, who was A.P. Corder. Corder was dogged in his determination to stop racial lynchings in the county, something which got him a degree of respect, at least from the black community, and possibly saved the life of one man. In early December of 1920, a black man named Sidney Williams was arrested and charged with assaulting the owner of a general store near Stonega, a man named Creed Robinette. Allegedly, Williams had gone into the store and purchased a pair of shoes. He then was supposed to have robbed Mr. Robinette of $800 and a diamond ring, then beat him with a blackjack so severely that the storefront owner had to be transported to a hospital in Louisville, Kentucky for treatment. That was pretty far away back in those days, Steve. And Williams was placed in the Wise County Jail in Wise, where the next night a mob, this time of 800 men from Appalachia, armed with firearms and dynamite, approached, intent on taking the prisoner and stringing him up.
And Sheriff Corder was ready for them. He had already armed his deputies with a machine gun and made sure they were all on duty at the jail that night. He and his men were able to beat back 2 assaults on the jail, in the process killing 2 men, including the leader of the mob, 23-year-old Tate Blondell, a chauffeur from Appalachia, and wounding several others. Things got so bad the Virginia militia was called out to restore order. It was the militia that took Sidney Williams from the jail, transported him by car to Norton at the train station, and then took him by special train to a jail in Roanoke for safekeeping. On January 5th, 1921, Mr. Williams was tried and found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in the state penitentiary. Now, all was quiet for the next 7 years. Now, this last lynching is one we've already told you about in a previous podcast, so we'll kind of be a little bit brief here. If you'd like to know more, go to our website at storiespodcast.net and look up our podcast on Leonard Wood.
Well, to kind of give you a compressed version of what we're talking about here, on November 19th, 1927, a brand new highway was opened up between Pound, Virginia and Jenkins, Kentucky, over Pine Mountain. On that day, Governor Byrd of Virginia and Governor Fields of Kentucky appeared at a reviewing stand that had been built on the side of the road. And the 2 men made their speeches in support of a new highway from there. After the event, everyone left the top of the mountain and headed home, leaving only that reviewing stand. A week after the opening festivities, 3 men came up that road from Pound, headed to Jenkins. Herschel Deaton, Bill Townsend, and Ernest Jordan were looking for some action of a romantic, lustful nature, and they came into the black section of Jenkins, a place called Slick Rock, to see what they could find.
And what they found was Leonard Woods, a black miner, and 2 women, Susan Armister and Anna Mae Emery. Now, nobody knows for sure what the group talked about, but whatever it was, it enraged Woods, who shot and killed Herschel Deaton. Now, one version of the story was that Woods and the woman demanded a ride, and when Deaton refused, Woods shot him. That's kind of the official version. Mm-hmm. The other version was that Deaton and the other 2 men were looking for women, and Woods objected to his lady friends going off with this unknown group of white men on a wild joyride through Appalachia. Deaton and Woods then got into an argument, then a fight, and then Woods shot him in self-defense. Woods and the 2 women were arrested and placed in the jail in Whitesburg for safekeeping. Unfortunately, Rod, the Whitesburg jail was not safe enough.
No, it wasn't, Steve, because 2 nights after the arrest, a mob of men came over Pound Gap headed toward Whitesburg. They broke into the jail, they took Woods and headed for the scene of the crime in Jenkins. One story, Steve, if I'm not mistaken, had at least accounts of him being dragged between 2 cars and being hauled up the Jenkins side of the mountain to get him to Pound Gap, and he was drugged, almost even pulled apart sometimes. But anyway, we're trying not to be gross here, but unable to lynch Woods on the side of the Jenkins side of Pound Jenkins Mountain, one of them remembered that reviewing stand up on top of Pine Mountain would serve just the right trick and called for the mob to head up there. They hanged Leonard Wood from that stand. Then, if that wasn't bad enough, they shot him. And then, for good measure, on top of that, They burned his lifeless corpse and left it there to be found the next morning. If I'm not mistaken, Steve, I think it was found over in a ditch or somewhere
Mm-hmm.
close to a ditch after that.
Yeah.
In fact, the entire incident led to a conflict between Virginia and Kentucky, with each side of the state and each side pointing at each other, claiming that the lynching occurred in their part of the state and they weren't going to take responsibility for it. But the sad note, so many people visited the crime scene over the next 2 weeks that the platform eventually collapsed.
And in fact, Rod, no member of the mob was ever arrested or charged for that murder. Now, this clearly, the worst of the 3 recorded lynchings in the county, sparked Governor Byrd to action. In March 1928, he put together a meeting of concerned officials, including the editor of the Norton newspaper, the Crawford Weekly, Bruce Crawford, to come up with a solution for extrajudicial mob justice. At Byrd's urging, the Virginia legislature passed the first anti-lynching law in the South, empowering state officials to investigate and prosecute extra-legal lynchings, the forerunner of today's hate crime laws.
Wow. And just to think, we've talked about 3 of these that really have stood out, but there were so many more going on in Appalachia during this time, and so many more that some aren't recorded, I'm sure. But, these are the ones that have made it at least to the headlines of some of the local newspapers, and also into memory, into the history book.
Well, the fact that this happened in 1921 to 1927 is important. Before that, especially in the last part of the 19th century, there wasn't a lot of this that we can see this blatantly going on.
Right.
But if you recall, in the late teens and early 20s, the KKK was starting to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, if you go back and look at a lot of the newspapers from the early 20s, you'll see all kinds of stories and ads for joining the Ku Klux Klan and the KKK having parades, bring your family down. It's a nice big family bit of entertainment. So I think there was an uprise in racism at that time, which obviously led to the last one being absolutely horrible, one of the worst I've heard of, to be honest with you.
And I'm thinking too, there was a story that I don't know if we've touched on it, or maybe it's one that we need to touch on a little bit further, but didn't the Ku Klux Klan make a kind of an incursion over into Letcher County, Kentucky, and there was a big ado over there over something like that? That was sometime around the turn of the century too. I'm going to have to go back into my history book and look a little bit and see what I can find about that. But as you said, this was when they were starting to kind of get back at least a foothold into the area, or what they thought was a foothold, and to, start kind of dishing out their quote unquote propaganda to people to let them know that they were the so-called boss at that time.
Yeah, that's true. And folks, that's the story of the 3 known lynchings in Wise County, Virginia, that spurred the passage of the first anti-lynching law in the former Confederacy. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, you can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, Audible, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and so many more I can't even name them all. Till next we meet. So long, everybody.
So long.